Walt Hargrove looked me dead in the eye across that conference table and said, "Blood runs this company, Reed. Always has, always will." The room had gone completely still. Not quiet the way a room gets when someone says something polite. Quiet the way it gets when something breaks and everybody knows it and nobody wants to be the first to look at the pieces. There were 14 people at that table. Dispatchers I'd hired, operations managers I'd trained from scratch, my 2 senior account reps who had been with me for over a decade. Outside the window, I could hear a diesel engine idling in the yard, one of our trucks warming up for a morning run. Inside, nobody moved. Nobody looked up. They all just stared at the tabletop like the wood grain had suddenly become the most interesting thing they'd ever seen. That was the moment. Right there, on a Tuesday morning in March, in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. My name is Reed Calloway. I'm 51 years old. And for 22 years, I ran Hargrove Freight and Logistics out of Fort Wayne, Indiana. Not on paper, not with a title anyone outside the building would recognize, but in every way that actually matters in this business, I built that company. I should back up. I met Carol Hargrove at a bar in Columbus when I was 28. She was funny and sharp and honest in a way that made me feel like I'd been going through the motions my whole life before I met her. We got married a year and a half later. Her father, Walt Hargrove, ran a small regional freight operation. 6 trucks, 11 employees, a rented lot on the south side of town with a chain link fence that leaned about 15 degrees to the left. He offered me a job managing dispatch. I took it because Carol asked me to and because I genuinely thought I could help. I had a background in operations and logistics, nothing fancy. Community college, 5 years at a supply chain firm in Dayton, a whole lot of time reading industry manuals on lunch breaks and Saturday mornings. I wasn't some hotshot. I was just a guy who understood how freight moved and where most companies bled money without realizing it. Hargrove Freight was bleeding from just about everywhere. So I fixed it, one problem at a time, 1 year at a time. I renegotiated vendor contracts in year 1, built a routing optimization system from scratch in year 2, taught myself the software on weekends using my own laptop, landed our first state contract in year 3. By year 8, we had 40 trucks and 3 full-time account managers. By year 15, we had over 90 trucks, 3 regional hubs, and a federal contract with the Department of Transportation worth $422 million a year. Walt gave me the COO title somewhere around year 10. No equity, no formal ownership agreement. Just a title and a salary of $115,000 that hadn't changed in 4 years, even as the company I was running had tripled in revenue. But here's the thing about working inside a family business when you married into it. You're never really inside, you're always the son-in-law, the helpful one, the guy who keeps the trucks moving so the real family can take the credit at the Christmas dinner table. I understood that in a quiet way for most of those 22 years. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself the work was enough. Then Walt's son Tad graduated with his MBA. Tad Hargrove was 32, sharp-dressed, and had exactly 0 days of freight experience. What he had was Walt's last name and a head full of business school frameworks that had never been tested against anything real. He came into the company talking about operational pivots and value chain optimization. Meanwhile, he couldn't tell you the difference between a standard dry van rate and a flatbed quote, couldn't read a load board, couldn't explain why fuel surcharges move the way they do. I trained him anyway, because that's what you do. You show up, you do the work, you don't make it personal. For 14 months, I walked Tad through every system I'd built, every client relationship I'd developed, every vendor deal I'd structured over 2 decades. He took notes and nodded and occasionally used the word synergy in ways that made our dispatchers stare at the ceiling, but I was patient. I figured Walt was easing him in, building him up gradually, and that there'd be a real conversation at some point about what the future structure looked like. There was a conversation. Just not the one I expected. Walt called the annual operations meeting on a Tuesday in March. I sat down at that conference table expecting a standard quarterly review. Instead, Walt stood up, thanked the team for a strong year, and announced that effective immediately, Tad would be assuming the role of Chief Operating Officer and taking full operational control of Hargrove Freight and Logistics. No heads up, no phone call the night before, not even a pulled aside in the hallway. I looked at Walt. He met my eyes for exactly 1 second, then looked away toward the window. I asked, as calmly as I could manage, what my role would be going forward. And that's when he said it. Blood runs this company, Reed. Always has, always will. 14 people in that room. The diesel engine still idling outside. And every single person at that table suddenly found something very important to look at on the floor. I sat through the rest of that meeting for another 35 minutes. Smiled when it was appropriate. Shook Tad's hand at the end. Walked back to my office and closed the door behind me. On my desk was the notebook I'd kept for 22 years. Dark brown leather cover, worn soft at the corners from handling. I'd bought it at an office supply store in Dayton the week before I started at Hargrove, back when I thought I'd be there maybe 3 years, learn the family business, figure out a next step. Inside, it was everything. Every client contact I'd cultivated, every pricing adjustment I'd made, and the reasoning behind it. Every vendor relationship I'd built from scratch with notes on who to call, what they responded to, what they didn't. Routing modifications with dates. Contract renewal cycles, the names of procurement officers at every government agency we worked with, their direct lines, their preferred communication styles. 22 years of institutional knowledge in my handwriting. None of it on a company server. None of it backed up anywhere Walt or Tad could access. I picked it up and just held it for a while. That evening, Carol called. She'd already heard from her father. She was quiet on the phone in a specific way I recognized, the quiet of someone who'd already had the argument and lost. She said she was sorry. I told her I wasn't going anywhere yet, that I needed a few days to think. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already started thinking the moment I walked out of that conference room. I took 3 days. Told the office I was working from home, which I did, just not on Hargrove work. I sat at my kitchen table with the notebook open and went through it page by page, not out of nostalgia, out of calculation. Here's what I found on day 2. Our 3 largest federal contracts, combined value just over $9 million annually, had all been negotiated by me personally. Not in Walt's name, not under a general company contact. My name was the primary operational contact in each contract, with my direct phone number in the performance clause. 2 of those contracts contained specific language requiring continuity of the designated operational lead as a condition of performance compliance. I'd written that language myself during negotiations years ago without thinking too hard about what it meant for me personally. I was just trying to protect the company's client relationships. Turns out I was protecting something else entirely. I pulled up the actual contract documents on my personal laptop, copies I'd kept for my own reference over the years, and read those clauses 3 times, slowly. Then I looked at the routing optimization system I'd built in year 2 and updated every year since. It lived on a personal drive. I'd built it on my own time, on my own equipment, before Hargrove had any kind of IT infrastructure worth mentioning. There was no IP assignment clause in my original employment contract. Walt had never thought to ask for one. His lawyer at the time was a general practice guy in Fort Wayne who mostly did real estate closings. The system that had reduced Hargrove's fuel costs by 19% over 6 years and given us a competitive edge on every federal bid we'd won. It had never been formally transferred to the company. I closed the laptop and sat there with my coffee going cold. I want to be straight about what happened next because it would be easy to make it sound more dramatic than it was. I didn't feel like some guy in a movie who'd just discovered a secret weapon. Mostly I just felt tired. Tired and very, very clear. I'd spent 22 years treating this company like it was mine because in every functional sense it was. I'd acted in good faith every single day. I'd shared everything I built without ever asking for protection in return because it never occurred to me that I'd need it. That wasn't naivety exactly. That was trust. And trust, I was learning, is worth exactly what the other person decides it's worth. I thought about Scott Langford. Scott owned Midland Transport out of Columbus. We'd crossed paths at logistics conferences over the years, shared a table at a Dot Industry luncheon once. He was the kind of guy who asked technical questions and actually listened to the answers. He'd reached out to me twice in the past 4 years, nothing aggressive, just a standing offer. His last message, about 6 months back, read, "Offer still stands." We value experience here. Gray hair means wisdom in this building. I'd ignored it both times, out of loyalty, out of habit, out of the belief that eventually the people you build something for will recognize what you built. On the 3rd day, I called him. "I was beginning to think you'd never actually pick up the phone," he said, and he sounded genuinely pleased, not smug about it. We met 2 days later at a BBQ place on the outskirts of Columbus, a spot we'd eaten at twice before after contract negotiations. No white tablecloths. No power dynamics baked into the decor, just good food and a straight conversation. Scott was in his mid-50s, built like someone who'd loaded trucks before he'd learned to manage budgets. He asked smart questions about routing margins, federal compliance cycles, hub-to-hub efficiency ratios. He didn't need me to explain the basics. That alone told me something. The offer was $195,000 base salary, 8% profit sharing, senior VP of operations over 3 regional hubs. A team where the average age was 46. And then he said something I'd never once heard in 22 years at Hargrove. Your name goes on every contract you work. And if you've built systems on your own time and your own equipment, we have a formal acquisition process, fair valuation. You get credited? I drove home that night thinking about the routing system sitting on my personal drive. Carol was still awake when I got in. We sat at the kitchen table for a long time, she said. My father built a company. You built the company he has now. Those are two different things, Reed. She said it quietly, like she'd been holding it for a while and had finally decided to put it down on the table between us. I told her I was going to call Scott back in the morning. She nodded and said, "Good." I called Scott the next morning, told him I was in. We agreed on a start date 3 weeks out. I typed up my resignation letter that afternoon. 2 weeks' notice. Clean, professional, no editorializing. Printed it on plain paper, not company letterhead. That felt right. Before I submitted it, I did something else first. I opened my laptop and drafted 3 separate emails. One to each of the federal procurement officers I'd worked with over the years. People I'd built real working relationships with, not company relationships, not Walt Hargrove relationships, mine. The emails were formal and straightforward. I informed each of them that I would be transitioning out of my role at Hargrove Freight and Logistics, that my last day would be in 2 weeks, and that going forward I could be reached through Midland Transport in Columbus. I included Scott's company contact information and noted that I would be personally overseeing federal logistics operations in my new capacity. I didn't badmouth Hargrove, didn't editorialize, just informed them of a change in my contact information, which I was fully entitled to do. Each of those contracts listed me as the designated operational lead. Notifying the relevant parties of my status change was not just my right in 2 of the 3 contracts, it was technically my obligation under the performance clause. I sent all 3 emails, then walked the resignation letter down to Walt's office. He was on a call when I knocked, held up one finger without looking at me, finished his conversation, then leaned back in his chair the way he always did when he was about to say something he'd already decided. I put the letter on his desk. He read it in about 10 seconds. 2 weeks, he said. Not a question. 2 weeks, I said. He asked where I was going. I told him Midland Transport. His expression shifted, not anger exactly. More like someone who just realized they'd left the back door unlocked during a storm. He asked if we could talk about a different structure, maybe a shared arrangement with Tad. I told him about the Midland offer. He said they were overpaying. I told him that was between me and them. He said he hoped this wouldn't complicate things with Carol. I said that Carol and I had talked it through and were good. Then he said, "I built this company from nothing, Reed." I looked at him for a moment. "You built 6 trucks and a leaning fence, Walt. I built the rest. We both know that." I walked out before he could answer. The next 2 weeks were strange in the way that endings always are when nobody wants to admit something is ending. People who'd barely acknowledged me in the hallway for years suddenly wanted to grab lunch. The senior dispatcher, a guy named Phil who'd been with me for 11 years, stopped by my office the second day to say he'd heard the news and that he was sorry to see me go. He didn't say much else. He didn't need to. We both understood what my leaving actually meant for the people who did the real work around there. Tad started following me around with a legal pad. He had questions about everything: the DOT contract renewal timelines, the vendor rate structures, how we handled weight compliance audits, why we routed certain loads through Columbus instead of directly. I answered every question patiently, completely. If I was going to leave, I was going to leave clean, but there were 2 things I didn't hand over. The first was the routing optimization system. Nobody asked me directly about it, which told me that Tad didn't fully understand what it was or that it existed as a separate standalone tool. To him, it probably just looked like the company's freight moved efficiently. He didn't know there was a specific system behind it, built on a personal drive, updated on my own time for 22 years. I wasn't going to volunteer that information. It wasn't deception, it was simply not giving away something that had never been theirs to begin with. The second thing I didn't hand over was the federal relationships. On my last Friday, Tad stopped by my desk around 4 in the afternoon and asked if I'd set up a transition call with the DOT procurement contacts so he could introduce himself before I left. I told him I'd send him the contact information, which I did: names, emails, office numbers, everything that was in the public contract files. What I didn't tell him was that those procurement officers had already heard from me 2 weeks earlier, that they already had Midland Transport's information in their files, that when Tad called those numbers on Monday morning and introduced himself as the new COO of Hargrove Freight, he'd be talking to people who already knew where I'd gone and who were already wondering whether they needed to rethink their renewal conversations. I wasn't burning Hargrove down. I was just not carrying their water anymore. I cleaned out my desk on that last Friday afternoon. The notebook went into my bag first. Then a photo from the previous Thanksgiving carol, me and Clay on the back porch. The kid grinning in a Purdue sweatshirt he'd worn almost every day since his acceptance letter arrived. Clay had started his freshman year that fall. The scholarship fund that Walt had informally promised us years ago, mentioned at a family dinner, never written down, never formalized, had quietly, never materialized. Walt hadn't said a word about it, neither had Carol's mother. It just disappeared the same way a lot of Walt's promises did, gradually and without acknowledgement. We were paying for it ourselves, it was tight, but we were managing. I picked up the photo, put it in my bag, and took one last look around the office that had never technically been mine. No door, no nameplate, just a desk in the corner because open floor plans promote collaboration, or so I'd been told. Through the window I could see the truck yard, 90-some vehicles lined up in the early evening light. Every routing decision behind every one of those runs built on systems I'd created. I walked out at 5:15 on a Friday and didn't look back. Monday morning, Tad started making phone calls. My first week at Midland Transport felt like stepping into a room where the air pressure was different. Not better or worse at first, just different. Nobody called me the son-in-law. Nobody CC'd Walt on emails to keep him informed. When I walked into a meeting and said something, people wrote it down and then actually did it. I had a real office, door, nameplate, window facing the yard, small things. But after 22 years of a corner desk and an open floor plan, I noticed. I spent the first 3 weeks doing what I always did when I came into an operation, listening before talking, mapping before moving. I sat with the dispatchers, rode along on 2 hub runs to understand how Midland's routes actually behaved versus how they looked on paper. I found 4 inefficiencies in the first 10 days that nobody had flagged because nobody had been looking at the right data. Scott didn't hover. He checked in once a day, asked one question, and left me to work. That was new too. We began integrating the routing optimization system into Midland's operations in week 4. Scott's team had formally acquired it through the process he described at dinner, documented fair market valuation. My name on the filing, it wasn't a fortune. That wasn't the point. The point was that for the first time in 22 years, something I'd built was officially, legally, unambiguously mine, and then mine to sell on my terms to someone who understood what it was worth. Within 2 quarters, fuel efficiency across Midland's primary routes had improved 17%. Dispatch error rates dropped. On-time delivery numbers went up enough that Scott put them in the company's federal bid documentation, which was being prepared for a DOT transportation contract renewal covering the Midwest Corridor, the same corridor, as it happened, that Hargrove Freight had held for the past several years. Both companies submitted bids. I knew Hargrove's numbers better than Tad did. I knew their cost structure, their margin tolerances, their weaknesses in the northern hub coverage. I didn't use any of that information improperly. I just built the best bid I could with Midland's actual capabilities, and Midland's actual capabilities, now running on better systems with better data, were genuinely stronger. The federal contract went to Midland, $12 million over 3 years. The week after the award was announced, my phone rang. The number was a Fort Wayne area code I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. It was Tad. He left a message that was a full 4 minutes long. The short version: Hargrove was struggling with 2 federal account renewals. Some of the contacts weren't responding well to him, and he was wondering if I'd be willing to consult informally, maybe just a couple of calls off the books to help smooth things over. He said Walt didn't know he was calling. He said he'd really appreciate it. I listened to the message twice, then I called him back. I told him I'd be glad to help in a formal consulting capacity. My current rate for external logistics consulting was $350 an hour, billed in 2-hour minimums with a 3-session retainer required upfront. I told him I could have a contract drawn up within the week if he wanted to move forward. He said he'd have to think about it. He never called back. Walt called 5 times over the following month. I let every one of them go to voicemail. Each message was a variation of the same theme: consulting opportunities, bringing my expertise back in a different capacity, substantial compensation, what happened to the family. The 5th message had an edge to it that the first 4 didn't. He mentioned the word loyalty twice. I sat with that word for a day. Loyalty. 22 years of 6 a.m. start times and vendor calls on Saturday mornings and federal compliance reviews that ran until 9 at night. 2 years of treating their problems like my problems because I'd stopped being able to tell the difference. If that wasn't loyalty, I didn't know what the word meant. And if it was, then Walt had gotten 22 years of it for free. I called him back on a Sunday morning. He picked up on the second ring, started talking before I could say anything: the company, the restructuring, the board conversations, how much had changed since I left. I waited until he stopped. Then I said, Walt, you told me blood runs that company. You were right about that. And I finally went back to mine. I hung up. 3 months later, I got a call from a reporter at a Midwest logistics trade publication. She'd heard about the federal contract win and wanted to talk about the routing methodology behind Midland's bid. We did a 30-minute phone interview. The article ran the following month, my name in the headline, my photo in the print edition, a full description of the optimization system I'd built and what it had done for Midland's operational numbers. First time in 22 years my name had appeared in print in connection with work I'd actually done. Scott framed a copy and left it on my desk without saying anything about it. I noticed it when I came in Monday morning. I left it there. Around that same time, I found out through Carol that Hargrove Freight had sold 40% of the company to a regional competitor to stabilize their cash position after the federal contract loss. Walt retired from the day-to-day not long after. Tad stayed on in a reduced capacity. I don't know the details and I don't need them. What I do know is that at the Midwest Logistics Industry Conference in Indianapolis that fall, Midland Transport was recognized for the federal contract win and for the operational improvements we'd posted over the previous year. Scott said a few words, then introduced me as the architect behind the work. I shook some hands, answered some questions, talked shop with people who understood what I was talking about. Carol was there. She'd driven down from Fort Wayne for the evening. She stood next to me during the reception in a blue dress I hadn't seen in a while, and she looked like someone who'd made a decision and was at peace with it. On the drive home, she told me that Clay had made the dean's list his first semester. I'd like to take credit for that, but the kid had always been sharper than me. He called the following week, said he'd seen the trade publication article online, said the headline was kind of cool, Dad, in an industry-specific way. That's about as much praise as a 19-year-old engineering student is going to hand out, and I'll take it. We paid for that first year ourselves. It was tighter than it should have been, but every dollar of it was clean. Here's the thing I want to leave you with because I've thought about it a lot in the 2 years since all of this happened. I spent 22 years building something inside a structure that was never going to give me credit for it. Not because the work wasn't good. Not because they didn't know the work was good, but because the structure wasn't designed to see me. I was the son-in-law. The helpful one. The operational backbone that made it possible for other people to stand at the front of the room. I'm not bitter about it. Mostly because being bitter would mean I regret the work, and I don't. The work was real. The systems held. The routes ran clean. You can be proud of something you built even if someone else put their name on it, as long as you eventually understand what's yours and what isn't. Here's what I want to leave you with. If you've spent years running someone else's operation, a family business, a company that had your fingerprints on everything but your name on nothing, you already know what I'm talking about. You felt it, that slow realization that loyalty only runs one direction in certain rooms, so know what you actually own, not what you've contributed to, not what you've been allowed to use. What is legally, documentably, provably yours, your relationships, your systems, your methods, your name in the right clause of the right contract. Document everything, date everything, understand the difference between their property and your leverage, and when the day comes, don't leave angry. Leave prepared. That's when everything changes.